I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
Am I afraid of the future?
I do think we can contribute to the future.
The mind is like a restless animal that craves being fed.
Välkomna till Global Access. Jag heter Anders Hellner och arbetar här på Utrikespolitiska institutet i Gamla stan i Stockholm. Kvällens Global Access kommer att innehålla en intervju med den amerikanske Harvard-professorn Paul Roazen. Och han är framför allt känd för att ha satt nytt ljus på psykoanalysens historia och särskilt dess förgrundsgestalt Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud som kanske är en av historiens allra mest kända intellektuella personligheter. Och här kommer vi att få en ny bild av denna portalgestalt. Paul Roazen intervjuas av Glans, chefredaktör för tidskriften Access. Kai, varför är Paul Roazen så intressant?
Fram till 60-talet så skrev psykoanalytikerna sin historia själva. Och det var på Freuds villkor. Så kom Paul Roazen som en outsider med en vetenskaplig metodik och undersökte förloppet. Han intervjuade så många människor han kunde få tag på. Man har kallat honom för psykoanalysens etnolog. Och han kunde då visa att den så att säga, officiella historieskrivningen på många punkter är mycket missvisande. Och det har gett oss en mycket bättre förståelse av psykoanalysens stormiga historia, hur schismerna gick till, vad man har försökt dölja och stoppa in i garderoben. Vad han visar är att Freud var en hänsynslös person. Han liknar honom vid Lenin, alltså en intellektuell som också är en maktutövare. Och det är en av de viktiga orsakerna till att psykoanalysen har varit så framgångsrik. Idag tror många att Freud upptäckte det omedvetna. Det är helt fel. Hela 1800-talet talade till exempel om det omedvetna. I Freuds samtid gjorde man också det. Men det är han som lyckades varumärka idén. Och det är det Paul Roazen hjälper oss att förstå. Hur blev Freud så framgångsrik?
Paul Roazen, som nu är verksam vid Harvard-universitetet i USA, var den första som började studera psykoanalysens historia utan att själv vara psykoanalytiker. I veckan var han i Stockholm för att samtala med Glans.
Professor Roazen, you were one of the first outsiders, so to speak, who started to write about the history of psychoanalysis. There were others around that time also, André Ellenberger and so forth, but you were a pioneer. What made you interested in psychoanalysis?
Well, I came to it first from an interest in intellectual history and in particular political philosophy. And my PhD thesis was on Freud and political theory. And I was looking at Freud within the tradition of political philosophy. Aristotle, Plato, Rousseau, Burke. I was trying to put Freud in terms of the history of Western thought.
But why would Freud be of interest from the point of view of political theory? He was a psychoanalyst.
Well, if you travel today in Buenos Aires or Mexico City, you will find on a local newsstand a copy of the first volume of Freud's works in Spanish combined with Rousseau's Social Contract for a very cheap price, maybe $10. They will put these two books together. To me, that is sort of a visualization of my project right from the beginning, to see Freud in connection with somebody like Rousseau and Social Contract. In other words, what is the nature of human beings? How do they relate to society? What are the goals? What would a fully developed person be like? What are the objectives of society, of organizing a good society? That sort of thing. that's how I saw him in terms of, and in particular, Rousseau wrote about forcing people to be free, using educational controls for the sake of promoting aspects of human personality. So that's how I saw him in terms of political theory.
But Freud also called psychoanalysis a movement, a Bewegung, as they say in German. And I think one of the peculiarities of psychoanalysis is that it was organized almost like a political international movement. So it would be relevant from that aspect also, I imagine.
Oh yes, but I would say more like a church than a movement, but more than a political movement. I mean, it was a hierarchical structure. And of course, in those days, when I started off in this work, Freud's daughter Anna was still alive. So there was, it's hard to describe how difficult it was to work in the subject at that time without causing offense to her. But there was it still is a movement. It's astonishing. Freud's capacities as a political leader, he was quite an organizer. He had representatives and emissaries in different parts of the world who carried on the mission.
What were the reasons for this specific structure of psychoanalysis as a church, you say? Because we're not talking about a ordinary, if I can use the term, intellectual movement. Psychoanalysis has many peculiarities, and one wonders why. Does it have to do with Freud's personality, with his ambitions, with the ideas as such?
I think it's not that unusual if one thinks of Wittgenstein in philosophy, for example, or movements in music or in art. They tend to have a inside group that are the bearers of the flame. Freud had thought he had a mission, and he was not he was rather personally modest about himself, but not modest about the objectives that he had in mind. Remember, around the turn of the century, there was the only alternative to Freud's approach was traditional religion. And that is what Freud was out to conquer.
Could you explain what you just said, that the only alternative to Freud was religion?
I think he saw psychoanalysis as a central alternative to religion, that it would be a way of structuring human experience in a non-theological context, not only without a belief in God, but without a belief in the necessity for church hierarchy. And there are many, this is a subject really all of its own. There are many peculiar aspects to the psychoanalytic movement which are only understandable in terms of a traditional religion. There are aspects of the movement which reflect a way of reinforcing people's orientation to the world rather than necessarily telling them something new. There are reminders of loyalty. It was a way of organizing a spiritual orientation towards the outside world and an orientation towards human experience that was transformative. It wasn't only the relationship between a patient and an analyst that was issue. It had to do with how people interacted with children and with spouses and with people they met on the street. And to an extraordinary extent, Freud succeeded. He changed the way people think about themselves and interact with other people. Even if it isn't always obvious what the impact of psychoanalysis has been, I think you will find that much more than many people are consciously aware of, Freud changed how we behave and how we conceive of ourselves.
But Freud also claimed that psychoanalysis is not a Weltanschauung, as he said. Did he have a faith to offer?
He claims that when he's old and he's sly. And the older he gets, the more of a pure science he tries to make it seem. But it was a worldview. And it was an ethical enterprise on Freud's part. I think he really thought that out of psychoanalysis would come a new morality, a new way, a higher. He didn't really conceive of it for, as we say in English, for every Tom, Dick, and Harry. He didn't conceive of psychoanalysis for ordinary people. It was supposed to be for special people, and those special people would help instruct mankind in a superior way of relating to themselves and to the world. Educate the special few, and they would in turn take care of the rest.
You said that religion was the only alternative, but this sounds very much like Marxism, I think, and the Leninistic belief in the avant-garde.
There are many comparisons between Freud and Lenin, actually. Solzhenitsyn has a novel on Lenin in Zurich before World War I. It's an excellent account of Freud's thinking. An excellent account of Freud's conviction that history was on his side and that he could afford to split the movement and get rid of people who were deviating from what he regards as the truth, that history was on his side. And there were many comparisons between Freud and Lenin. The faith he had that he was onto something, and he could discard renegades. He could purify the movement. It's really quite extraordinary, the conviction he had. But you know, if you go back to his biography, he had it very early. He had a very early conviction in his specialness. And as a writer, this is Freud's strong point. He not only was a great organizer, but he was a great writer. And it's there from the age of 17 or 18. We have letters. People were saving his letters from when he was 17, 18 years old, before he got into college. They were already starting to save his letters. They were that unusual. And this was the strength he had against all the rivals he has been up against in the 100 years since psychoanalysis has started. That as a writer he could tower over any of the alternatives. Not just the books he wrote, but the letters he wrote, and the way he had of describing human experience in I think, a fascinating way.
It's long been a part of the self-understanding of psychoanalysts that they were met with a lot of resistance. But when you look at it in a historical perspective, isn't the success of the movement astounding?
Well, it goes through waves of, I think the underground success of the movement is the really astounding things. It's the degree to which we are unaware of the way we interact with the people we love, how much of it is really colored by things that Freud taught us. But Freud wanted more than just that. He wanted recognition, and he wanted official recognition as well as unofficial acknowledgement. And he, to a large extent, he succeeded to an extraordinary degree.
So you came as an outsider and started to study this movement. How were you received? Were people suspicious?
No, I don't think they were too suspicious. You see, their ambitiousness to extend their influence meant that an outsider was welcomed. They were a little naive. Naive in the sense that my hunch is that they thought I was only going to go away learning what they wanted me to learn. That they didn't adequately anticipate that I might, in fact, pick up things that they preferred to keep private. Where I was delighted to, as a scholar, I was delighted to talk about things that hadn't been ever discussed before. And that was for them rather shocking when I did that. Remember, I was doing this work originally in 1965. In 1966, 64, I think I started my first interviews in 64. But by 65 and 66, I was working flat out on this stuff. And in those days, it was possible to publish collections of Freud's edited editions of letters with passages penciled out, without even indications that there were any omissions. You know, as an academically trained person, I was quite shocked to discover that books that I had been studying had been put together in a selective way about what Freud had written, let's say, to Lou Andreas Salome. There were various aspects of the history of psychoanalysis that I talked about that if I had been an insider, I would have disguised or suppressed. But as an outsider, I could say whatever I honestly concluded without fear of retribution. I couldn't be there were no sanctions they could use against me except the written word, except closing me off to further contact with them. And for a while I had trouble. I mean, but I've hung in there over the years. I mean, I must say, I did not allow myself to get excommunicated. But they couldn't really properly excommunicate me because I wasn't a member of the, I mean, I had no patients. I was not subject to any of the normal unconscious fears of being thrown out of the movement. My interests have stayed pretty much the same ever since. And one of the first things I was interested in is how it differed from country to country. For example, very naive. First, I was interested in England and America, where Freud's books had been translated at the same time into English, and how the movement differed in those two countries. Well, by now, that's a whole subject all itself. I mean, how it differs, you know, in Japan or China or Russia or Sweden or Finland or Italy and France and Germany. That's a whole subject in itself. I mean, how the world reacted to Freud's ideas in its own terms and how they put their own impress on it.
But you and later on perhaps many others have discovered a lot of material and incident that aren't that flattering for Freud or psychoanalysis. Isn't it strange that a movement who wanted to take away the repressions concerning the past has repressed so much of its own past?
Well, I'm not sure the word suppressed. They, but that's not surprising. Any, matter of fact, the extent of the contrast between what was in the books and what was reality, as I could reconstruct it, held my interest, actually. And I've been rather suspicious about going back to my earlier work in terms of the history of ideas, because I was so skeptical of written history after discovering the contrast between the way in which the books had been put together about something that happened in the 20th century, that I thought to myself, I don't trust going back any further. This is a job enough to untangle. But there was there's been quite a lot to study and talk about in terms of, I mean, you mentioned the whole issue of psychoanalysis and Marxism, for example, would be a subject all in its own. You know, how social democratic people reacted to Freud as opposed to how conservative political thinkers reacted to Freud as opposed to how liberals or how the communists reacted to psychoanalysis. I mean, this would be a subject all of its own, the strictly political uses of psychoanalysis.
Could you say something about the main differences between the written and, should we call it, the oral history of psychoanalysis?
Well, it's immense. Well, the Freud's sense of humor, for example, the complexities of his sense of humor is something nobody has ever adequately written about. You know, he wrote one book about jokes and the unconscious. Nobody writes about that book. It's so complicated. Humor, how one understands the psychology of humor. That's one of his, really one of his more ambitious books. He's trying to solve the problem of jokes. And it's full of jokes of his own. I mean, or that he's, you know, collected together. They're not invented by him. That's one of his subtlest books. Nobody writes about it. He used to use jokes in his therapeutic practice. Spontaneously, various rabbi stories would come to him, for example. And that they were all very rich experiences. You can't put that, you can't make it as a recommendation of technique that the therapists have a sense of humor. But there was a story, one of Freud's Viennese pupils on moving to America said to another one of Freud's pupils in America, "What am I to do?" He was analyzing at that point very upper class Boston Gentile patients, not Jewish patients. And he said, "How can I analyze without Jewish jokes? What am I to do?" And about a year later, the other analyst said to him, "Well, how's it going without the Jewish jokes? How are you managing?" He said, "Aha, I tell the stories, but I substitute a minister for the rabbi. I baptize the jokes." But it would have been characteristic of the early Freud. They had a great deal of freedom that, of course, young people, when they're starting out, are legitimately shy about adopting. Freud he was quite a considerable person, and he was and of course the fear, this is where I guess I was bold, that the fear of disagreeing him was unconsciously very powerful, and it has remained that way. Becoming a dissident, becoming a deviation, was a frightful possibility. I mean, to get back to the Lenin analogy, the threat was that one would be derailed from history, that one would be forgotten. And it did happen to a lot of people. That's what makes it, from the point of view of intellectual history, so interesting. That a lot of the most interesting ideas were ignored because they were expressed in opposition to positions Freud had taken.
I think what's striking is the hardness in Freud's attitude towards people who disagreed with him. In a way, I would doubt that he was an empathic character. You point to his sense of humor, but the oral history contains darker sides of Freud. Also, you uncovered the tragic history of Tausk, for instance,
Right.
who committed suicide, partly, I imagine, because of the way Freud treated him, and that he analyzed his daughter Anna, for instance.
They thought of themselves as Superman. He was a Nietzschean Superman, that he was beyond good and evil, that he was making new rules that applied only to himself and to the select few around him. But he could be he put himself into some people, like Otto Rank, to an extraordinary extent. He extended it when he was young. Remember, he got cancer of the jaw in 1923. And of the people I interviewed, that would be the biggest single dividing line between those who knew him before his illness and those who knew him afterwards. He had cancer of the jaw for 16 years, but he changes. He becomes much more withdrawn. The Freud before the cancer of the jaw is a very different person than the one afterwards. But I think that he consciously knew that the way he dealt with that cancer was going to be one of the most important lessons he had for humanity. I really do believe this was part of his lesson, that he was going to be superior to it.
So he was hard towards himself, but also hard towards others.
That's what I mean. Of course, of course.
What's your view of Freud as a therapist?
Well, it depends with what sort of person and what stage of his life. I did one book based on my interviews with 10 of his patients, a book called How Freud Worked. Nothing like the stereotype of what you'd expect. He was better with interesting people than he was with, if I may put it that way, dull people. He distinguished, for example, and this is completely unchristian of him and characteristic, he would distinguish between worthy patients and good-for-nothings. He didn't want to bother with good-for-nothings, worthless patients. A lot of human troubles he didn't want to deal with. I mean, by our standards, he was quite shockingly intolerant of human diversity. But in people he considered exceptional and superior, he would put up with quite a lot of what would qualify as pathology. He could be remarkably accepting and understanding of it in a person that he thought was above the ordinary. But this is where he's deliberately unchristian, in the sense it's not every human soul that's precious to him. It's the exceptional few he wants to help.
Did he in any way set an example for other psychoanalysts with this intolerance? Is it a general characteristic of the movement?
Well, it's changed since his, in the years since his death. There's been a broadening of the scope of psychoanalysis, so that nobody can be as picky and choosy as Freud could afford to be. Was not an ordinary person. And was not interested in the problems of ordinary human life. He was aiming to be extraordinary. And this is where lots of the problems come in, because what he considered himself entitled to do, not other people might not be entitled to do. And that's where a lot of the gulf between the model he set and the practices that the others were supposed to follow came in, because what was suitable for Freud was not necessarily going to be suitable for them after him. But a lot of them were capable of doing things that look outrageous now, following Freud's practices. Analyzing his own daughter was quite that's one of the things I put in print for the first time. One doesn't know to what extent it was her decision or his decision, and it was obviously a mutual one between the two of them. She wouldn't discuss it and talk about it. But psychoanalysis was the most important aspect of human life for both of them. A pity, in a way, for any ideology to become more important than life. But he was determined to put his mark on human culture, and I think in that sense, he succeeded.
What you and later on quite a few others have shown is that Freud was perhaps not that sympathetic as a character always, that he suppressed things and so forth. But you could be that kind of character, I imagine, and still a good scientist. But does anything of this has a scientific implications? Did it flaw psychoanalysis in any way? Freud's ambition to create a mythology about himself?
Well, it certainly put a lot of people off in the rest of the world of science. The cult side of psychoanalysis certainly made a lot of people suspicious of what Freud's teaching added up to. But I don't think anybody sensible would think that the world of psychotherapy or the world of psychoanalytic psychology is a pure science. This is an art as well as a science. This is an ethic as well as a neutral technique. This is a moral reorientation as well as anything else. But a friend of mine, an English psychoanalyst, has maintained every clinical encounter is simultaneously an ethical one. Now, Freud would not have liked that principle, but I think it's true. And I think that's where the example of Freud has got more to teach than the written technical recommendations. Because the degree to which every clinical encounter is an ethical one at the same time means that all kinds of moral choices are being made. I mean, Freud was always saying that everything you do has a cost. I don't mean financial cost, although that is not minor either. But he meant that he was dubious about progress, and I agree with him on that. But Freud didn't believe there was such thing as progress. I don't think there's such thing as progress. As a matter of fact, I think that the issues Freud dealt with 100 years ago are the same things we're dealing with right now.
But still, you said earlier that he had the ambition to transform the world. So, wouldn't that mean a kind of progress?
Oh, no, I don't think so. I think he'd be horrified at the degree to which human privacy has been compromised. I mean, he would be people marching in the street for gay liberation, people demonstrating about their, I mean, exhibiting them to Freud. This would have been exhibitionism.
Discovering secrets about Freud's private life has almost become an industry. There's a lot of books published, some serious, some not so serious. Why this tremendous curiosity about Freud's private life?
Well, what kind of person he is. So much of himself went into his theories. It's such an autobiography. Psychoanalysis is such an autobiography that the more you understand about Freud, the more you understand of both the strength and the limitations of the thought he came up with.
But you have also defended Freud against some of his critics lately. What would you say is the main problem with that criticism?
Ahistorical. It's ahistorical. I wrote an article once called, "Was Freud a Nice Guy?" You can make Freud look monstrous simply because he's different and came out of a different century. Remember, Freud's born in 1856. The expectations of life were so different then.
And do you mean this explains some of his harsher attitudes towards patients and other people, for instance?
Well, don't forget the practice of psychotherapy was just getting going then. He was starting it. His intolerance of various things. He was, but he became much more so after he's sick. I think how distant he was as a father. I mean, you can condemn anybody from present. See, what I object to is what historians call presentism, the assumption that we are superior to the past by virtue of the fact we're different. And therefore it's easy to hand out grades to any previous generation based on our own standards. But by that same principle, it means that 10 years from now we're going to look like nincompoops too.
You have devoted a large part of your life to the study of Freud.
Yes, evidently.
And so has many others. Will he continue to occupy our imagination and thoughts, or will he fade away in a way to become more of a traditional intellectual person in history?
I don't, again, I'm thinking of it as a writer, I don't see anybody yet one thinks of novelists and other writers who have a permanent place in Western thought, but I don't think among psychologists there's anybody like Freud.
Thank you, Professor Roazen.
Thank you for having me.
Ni har sett ett program i serien Global Access. En programserie som sänds här på TV8 under hela våren. På söndagar klockan 22.00 och torsdagar klockan 23.00 möter ni de största tänkarna som svarar på de svåraste frågorna.
The mind is like a restless animal that craves being fed.
Missa inte Global Access. Söndagar klockan 22.00 och torsdagar klockan 23.00.